the image that we see of Africa in the media of a poverty-stricken continent, although obviously it has elements of truth, belies the fact that for the past 500 years Africa has been central to the growth of the global economy. Obviously going back from the slave labour that was taken from Africa to provide labour on the sugar, tobacco, cotton plantations in the Caribbean that provided the surplus capital that laid the basis for the Industrial Revolution. From into the 19th century with the gold and diamond mines, again manned by cheap African labour, often slave or close to slave labour. And today, in many ways, it's the same. Africa still provides a huge amount of wealth to the Western financial companies and corporations through the plantations that they own. We all know about the scandals of the cocoa plantations, where child labourers covered in machete wounds from being forced essentially by economic circumstance to work in the fields all day long. And the minerals that are still looted to this day by multinational companies who, through Western governments, use stooge regimes that, with their support, like Rwanda and Uganda, to basically steal the mineral wealth of places like the Congo. And if we go, that's the image. We often think of Africa, we think of sub-Saharan Africa. But obviously Africa has a north of Saharan region as well. And since the British took over many of the North African and Arab countries from the Ottoman Empire, they imposed a system of puppet rulers, puppet monarchs in place, to one of the reasons which I believe was to keep the continent disunited between North and South. And in 1969 in Libya, when Gaddafi led the revolution that overthrew the British-backed King Idris, Libya joined Egypt and Iraq as the latest of those states to overthrow their puppet British-imposed monarchies. One of the first things the new Libyan government did, which greatly angered the West, was to chuck out the US and British air bases from Libyan soil. And this was very important. This was not just a symbolic act. If I could just read to you from Jonathan Behrman's 1986 book, one of the very few scholarly accounts of Gaddafi's Libya. He says, "For Libya's strategic patrons, Britain and the US, the anti-colonial course embarked on by the new authorities had its most immediate and devastating impact in the elimination of their military bases. These are of no minor significance. The British and American military facilities in Libya added an extra dimension to the Western NATO alliance, particularly regarding possible intervention in the region. The ranges around Wheelus Field and Al Adem were unrivaled in the scope they offered for military exercises. Whilst the RAF and the USAF benefited from near-perfect conditions for low-level flying runs, in Cyrenaica, the British retained access to terrain ideal for large-scale practice manoeuvres." So this was a big deal, and it straight away indicated the kind of attitude to the former colonial powers that the new Libyan regime was going to have. In 1973, that was further exemplified when the famous OPEC decision to cut supplies of oil to the West in the light of the Arab-Israeli war. That decision was famous. What's less famous is well known as that was Gaddafi that was spearheading this move, which obviously greatly damaged Western economic exploitation of the region. In 1979, the Libyan regime embarked on a kind of socialization of the economy of a different type to the Soviet model. Again, if I can read to you from the same book as before, it says, "What in fact occurred after the expropriation of the capitalists was not the assumption of direct state control, but a process of cooperativization. Within each workforce, vocational congresses embracing the whole workforce were established and were vested with control of production. the foundations of management, previously the responsibility of owners' nominees, were entrusted to a People's Committee chosen by members of the Vocational People's Congress, usually from among their workmates, but sometimes with outside specialists, accountants and technicians co-opted. So this was the new foundation of the new Libyan economy from the late 70s. Partly as a result of that, and the general use of oil wealth to pump back into infrastructures like the famous water project in Libya, Libya went from being one of the poorest countries in the world in the 50s and 60s to, in 2010, topping the list of African countries on the UN Human Development Index. The highest life expectancy on the continent, lowest infant mortality on the continent, and so on. Now, from the point of view of the West, all of this was obviously not a good model that they wanted other former colonial states to be following. And from the early 80s, there were dozens, in the first few years of the 80s, literally dozens of attempted coups with the support of MI6 and so on, all failed to oust Gaddafi. In 1996, we now know from David Shayler's testimony that MI6 had paid Al-Qaeda to assassinate Gaddafi, which again they failed to do. There was a D notice. It wasn't legal to report it in the British press, but it was widely reported in the Australian press when that came out a few years ago. Moving closer to the current time, Gaddafi was one of the key, probably the key driving force behind the foundation of the African Union 10 years ago. He was also, his government in Libya funded Africa's first ever satellite in 2007. Well, it cost £400 million, 300 million of which was contributed by Libya. This meant that European companies whose satellites used to have to be used for people making phone calls to and from Africa were bypassed, and a huge chunk of income was lost to those European telecommunications companies. So he's continued to be a thorn in the side of the exploitation of the continent. And this particularly came to a head when the African Union started seriously in the last few years to develop financial institutions. Three key institutions. The African Monetary Fund was set up to basically, along with the African Investment Bank, to rival IMF hegemony on the continent. The IMF, everyone's heard of third world debt, so-called. People are aware, I'm sure, that the IMF used the debt mechanism to force neoliberal privatization policies to make extraction of wealth from the third world more easy. These institutions would have seriously threatened IMF control of the continent, as would have the African Central Bank, which was set up by the African Union, which was preparing to launch its own African gold-backed currency, the African dinar. Libya is by far the biggest financial contributor to all of these projects, contributing $30 billion to them, far more than any other single country on the continent. So this was a real threat not only to the hegemony of IMF exploitation of Africa, but also to the role of the dollar in the key currency, and the franc actually, as the key trading currencies on the continent. So the role that's been basically the ascribed role for Africa in the capitalist imperialist global economy for the last 500 years was seriously under threat by Gaddafi and Libya's leadership within the African Union. This was further threatened recently, and still is, by Chinese investment, massive investment in infrastructure and manufacturing in Africa. If Africa can industrialize and can manufacture its own finished products, then that will challenge the role ascribed to it by the Western financial institutions of being just a producer of raw materials that will sell cheap raw materials to the West, who will then manufacture, process them and sell them back at extorted prices back to the continent. So really, for the first time, the last 10 years, for the first time, true economic independence of Africa has been on the cards. And Gaddafi has been one of the kind of driving forces behind this. So this is where AFRICOM comes in. This was in 2007. The US set up their own AFRICOM, African Command and Control Center for US forces and engagement on the African continent. Problem for the US was that no country wanted to host them. No country wanted to give back one of these US bases to host this new US initiative, which is basically a way for the US to try and prop up its waning economic dominance by military force. And again, Gaddafi was important here. He was the one who proposed to the African Union a motion that no African country would allow a US base on their soil, which was passed in 2010. Also, on a bilateral level, what tended to happen if the Americans offered a certain amount of money to an African country to host a base, then Gaddafi would say, well, what did they offer you? 10 million, we'll give you 20 million to tell them to piss off, essentially. Pardon my French. So this was a big headache for the US, British and French governments and the corporations and financial institutions they represent. So that brings us to the Libyan war, and one of the most disgusting things about this war is the way that this constant refrain about saving civilians has been used as a cover-up for, if you think about it, really what does it mean if you say we're going to bomb a country, but we're going to save its civilians? What it means is we're going to slaughter every last member of its armed forces, and that's exactly what's happened from day one of the NATO intervention, is that all of the Libyan army, who've never, mainly it's a very young country, as is most of North Africa, young population, these are young boys, barely out of their teens or still in their teens, being strafed in their hundreds and their thousands, night after night. They've never occupied another country, never invaded anyone, and yet they're being blitzed. Within 6 weeks already in the Telegraph, they were reporting that British officials in the army were claiming at least 35,000 Libyans had been slaughtered by NATO. But they're soldiers, so they don't count, they don't get on the news, it's only civilians that we're supposed to be interested in, whose life has any value. The other disgusting element of what's gone on is the racism, which has been very well documented in the rebel movement from the very second day of the uprising, before the NATO intervention. 50 African migrants were killed by the so-called rebels, and the rebels have been hunting black skins in Libya ever since. There's a brigade in Misrata that calls itself the Brigade for Purging Black Skins. The black town, which is a town of black Libyans, not African migrants in this case, of Tawaga, has now been, all 10,000 of its inhabitants have been killed or chased out of Tawaga after the rebel leader said that there's no such thing as Tawaga, there's only Misrata. They were given the blessing by the TNC leadership. Jibril said, what happens in Tawaga is the responsibility of no one except the people of Misrata, who were the ones doing the killing, began systematically torching every home and business in Tawaga until all of its citizens fled. So the question is, well, why did NATO put specifically these people in power? Why did it embark on this huge blitzkrieg to put these racists into power? And it's not just an accident, it's not just some unfortunate oversight, or the sort of unfortunate byproduct of an otherwise entirely worthy liberal revolution. This racism is an intrinsic part of the force that NATO has been cultivating in Libya and is now put into power. And it's an essential part of the strategy. It's part of the divide and rule strategy to prevent African unity by keeping North Africa divided from its southern neighbours. And the best way to achieve this is by installing anti-black Arab supremacists, which is exactly what the rebels are. For NATO's goals to be achieved, it had to be racists installed in power. It had to be people who could be relied on to reverse the path of regional integration that Gaddafi had begun, and who would turn their back on their southern neighbours and all of their economic links, all of their political alliances. They would look north to Europe and not south to sub-Saharan Africa. And it was precisely the racists who the NATO countries have been cultivating in their allies in Libya for some time. For example, Al-Azawi, who's the third highest ranking member of the Transitional National Council, was in Gaddafi's government, but he fell out with Gaddafi after he claimed that black Africans were a burden, that they spread disease and crime and so on. And he said all this in the wake of some anti-black massacres that had happened in 2000. So these are precisely the people that NATO have been cultivating to take power, not despite their racism, but because of it. And again, the killing or expulsion of Libya's guest workforce, Libya relies heavily on African migrant workers, there were nearly 2 million of them, will obviously have a devastating effect on the Libyan economy. So for NATO, this racism helps them achieve both of their goals. On the one hand, a weak, dysfunctional Libyan state and economy, and on the other hand, an anti-African Libyan foreign policy. So I just want to finish off by I think what's interesting as well for us here is what does the lack of opposition to this clearly classic imperial slaughter in this country tell us about ourselves here in this country? I think we're not as ignorant as a nation as we like to pretend sometimes. There are things 10 years ago that 10 years ago seemed crazy and now common knowledge. So, number one, the West slaughters hundreds of thousands of people in the third world to steal their resources. Who after Iraq can claim they don't know that? Everyone knows that. Secondly, the West financial institutions benefit from keeping third world populations poor, so they're forced to work for pennies in their sweatshops. Who doesn't know after the anti-globalization protests, after the protests against the IMF and WTO, after endless programs on TV about sweatshop conditions, who doesn't know about the mechanism of debt extortion, of third world debt, about sweatshops, about child labourers? Who can claim not to know these things now? I think the veil's been lifted from our eyes in the last 10 years. And as a result, we're willing, perhaps even desperate, for any old shit to smear in our eyes to disguise the all too obvious source of our wealth and power in the West, which is based on slaughter, exploitation, and nothing else. And this is why we swallow any old nonsense about any third world leader to justify intervention, not because we're ignorant of the real base motives, but because we're all too aware. Thank you.